Today we're going to talk about something that I think all of us at one time or another we deal with on varying levels. You know, there's a small discouragement where maybe you get a bad grade on a test or your boss yells at you. And then there's the big discouragements that come in life when we're expecting certain things to happen and they fail to happen. We're hoping that something won't happen that does happen. And so then we're caught in that place of pain and agony and where our heart is just crushed by something. And so what I want us to do is really think about our response to discouragement, because what happens, I believe, for most of us is that we just get caught up in the emotion of that, and I guess the emotions, plural, is a better way to say it, but we get caught up in that and we don't realize that the way that we confront those feelings, the way that we confront those situations has a lot to do with how we feel. I think maybe we get deceived a lot of times because we see a lot of movies and they say, oh, well, you know, you can't help it, how you feel, so on and so forth. But the truth is we can. The reason that we feel the things that we feel is because of the way that our brain processes that information. And so how we perceive something determines the reality of it for us, right? I mean, I think we can immediately think of Paul, the apostle, who while he's on the road, on his missionary journeys, he comes up against all these discouraging things. And as he matures in his ministry and in his response to that, he begins to count it joy. And he begins to be excited and to flourish in those missionary journeys. And so there's something that we can learn from that. We're actually going to go back to the Old Testament and look at Nehemiah. He was a very interesting person, a very visionary type leader who led the Israelites to rebuild the kingdom of Israel. And it's a great story, and really we could spend probably a whole year because the book of Nehemiah is so rich with many things. But we're going to kind of look at chapter 4 today primarily. But I want to read this. This is a quote from William Ward. And I think maybe this helps us to understand better our responsibility as we confront these emotions, we confront our understanding of what discouragement is. I think this is some great insight for us to start out with. Discouragement is dissatisfaction with the past, distaste for the present, and distrust of the future. It is ingratitude for the blessings of yesterday, indifference to the opportunities of today, and insecurity regarding strength for tomorrow. It is unawareness of the presence of beauty, unconcern for the needs of our fellow man, and unbelief in the promises of old. It is impatience with time, immaturity of thought, and impoliteness to God. Now, when I first read that, I was a little offended. You know, because here I am, I'm discouraged, I'm having a hard time with something, and then here comes along some guy and basically throws it in my face and says, well, it's my own problem. Well, I don't like to hear that. I like it, you know, like when I'm feeling down, what I really like is for my wife to come in and go, oh, Jonathan, I'm so sorry, and maybe she'll scratch my head, and, you know, some other things I won't mention probably here that she wouldn't like for me to say. But, you know, she comforts me and she encourages me and she gives me sympathy. But sometimes, not very often, but when I really need it, she kind of gives me a kick in the rear, not like, you know, literally, but verbally. It says, you know, man up, grow up, you know, get over it. It's not that big a deal. It's going to be all right. And so that's a little bit how this quote strikes me, because I want to kind of soak up the sympathy and just go away in my own little place and isolate myself and feel sorry and just kind of wallow in it, you know, thinking that somehow in doing that I'm going to feel better. But that, I believe, is actually a deception of the enemy, that he wants us to do that, because then we can get stuck there and he can keep us there and he can trap us and cause us to be ineffective. I mean, think about what would have happened if the early believers, if they had gotten discouraged, which they certainly have reason to be discouraged. What if they just quit and given up on the church altogether and they just went and hid somewhere to try to avoid all the persecution and hardship? Well, we wouldn't be here. Not a one of us. Christianity would have never spread, because it was God's plan to use those people just to cause his truths to spread out throughout the whole earth. And so because of their faithfulness, because they did not fall down and die when it came to that place of discouragement, but they stood up, they confronted it, they challenged it, and they overcame it, that we enjoy the truth and the saving knowledge of grace that we have, at least the opportunity to have today. Mother Teresa said, "No, I do not become discouraged. You see, God has not called me to a ministry of success. He has called me to a ministry of mercy." And see, maybe that's the problem right there. Maybe too many of us, we're seeking success. We're seeking money. We're seeking fame. We're seeking comfort. We just want to sit on the throne of our lives and reign supreme. And when that fails to happen, we become discouraged because we have the wrong goal. Rather than having God's focus, God's goals for our life, we have our own selfish goals, and when we fail to meet those, we become discouraged. So it's I hope right now, maybe at the beginning you're thinking, okay, here we go, he's going to try to encourage me, make me feel better, and you know what, I am trying to do that. That's absolutely true. And even if you're not in that place right now, we all know that we're destined to experience those times. So maybe you're thinking, well, okay, maybe I shouldn't completely dismiss this, because maybe you've not really stood up against that spirit of discouragement. Maybe you just kind of let it wallow you, and it takes you out for a while, and then through time you kind of get back in the groove, but then just to get squashed again. And so how do we get out of that cycle? That's an important question for all of us. I mean, I am just as susceptible to that cycle, and it comes in different ways, in different angles. And so just when I get protected and focused and determined not to fall down and get waylaid by the great crushing wave of disappointment in one area, then something happens over here, and so then I'm back there again. And so it's a very complicated thing. So let's turn, if you have a Bible or a phone or something where you can view the scriptures, and there's Wi-Fi here now, I understand. So those of you tablet users and kids with iPods, adults with iPods, well, you can now use that. I don't believe there's a password. You just look for Stained Glass Theater and then guest, and you can just log right in and use that. So let's look at Nehemiah. I'm not going to read the first few chapters. Chapter 4 is really want to focus, but I think you need to understand the story. All right. So for a minute, I want you to, because sometimes when we get to that place in the message and we're going to read the scriptures, we just think, okay, here we go, and we're going to get all intellectual and we're going to just get crazy with it. But what we want to do really is just read a story, understand the story, because if we don't take it in, if it doesn't become part of our lives, then it's useless to us, right? Because the substance, the meat of Scripture is living it out. It's not talking about it. It's not reading it only. It's living it out. And so if you can't sit down and tell me the story of Nehemiah and tell me, you might be able to, sit down and talk about all the Greek words and what they mean, and you might be able to do some kind of exegetical magic on the passage, and that's great, and we might all be impressed. But if we don't understand what's happened, if we don't understand the story, and we can't simply retell it and apply it to our lives, then we've missed something. And that happens a lot in church, doesn't it? We get so wrapped up in memorizing verses, and which is a great thing to do, and intellectualizing everything. And of course, I went to school forever to do all that intellectual stuff. But in the end of the day, all that really matters is do we know the story? Can we tell the story of Jesus? Can we tell the story of the apostles and the story of the early church? Because if we can't do that, then we're not people of the Word. We're not rightly dividing the Word. And whose responsibility is that? Is it my responsibility? Is it Jeff's? Is it John's? By no means. It is your responsibility as a believer to rightly divide the Word. All right, so let's get into this. Chapter 1, just as kind of a setup for our story, chapter 1 is where Nehemiah identifies the problem and he makes a commitment to fix it. All right, so what's the problem? Well, as the Israelites have, through a whole historical failure, basically, rejected God. God allowed the surrounding peoples, particularly the Babylonians, to come and wipe them out. They were carted off to slavery, and now Nehemiah, who was a Jew living in what's now Persia, and I guess all the history gets confusing because Persia conquered Babylon, and that's why a lot of them are living under Persian rule. And so, through a lot of circumstances, and it's a great story of how Nehemiah gets permission and supplies and things to go, he finds himself back in Jerusalem, and they're rebuilding the city. All right, because it was completely destroyed. There wasn't one stone left on top of another. And the only people that were left were the people that really wouldn't be good slaves. You know, they were weak or had some kind of problem, and they were just kind of left to fend for themselves, and this has gone on for a very long time. And he goes back to try to coordinate and inspire all of these people to come together to build back up the city of Jerusalem. Now you might think, well, okay, well, why does that matter? You know, why is that important? Well, you have to understand that during that time, national security was an issue. See, it's not really an issue for us because we have this professional army and Navy and Air Force and Marines and all these people that they protect us, they take care of that for us, so we can just wake up in the morning and go about our day. But in this particular case, the Jews were a persecuted, wiped out, conquered people, and they had many enemies. And it goes back for thousands of years because at one time, especially during Solomon's reign, Israel was a powerful nation and they subdued all the surrounding nations. So they're all kind of bitter and very happy that Israel was wiped out. The Hebrew people were crushed and taken off as slaves, and they do not want for them to become a kingdom again, because that just means problems for them. So they are going into a hostile place, and in order for them to have a civilization again, they've got to begin to rebuild. So shops and walls and towers and farms and all those things, they've got to recreate. And so this is a big task, a very big task. And so Nehemiah sets out to do it. In chapter 2, he asks for God's help and he recruits others. All right, so he sets out his task. He realizes, well, duh, I can't do this alone. So he recruits people to join him, and he gets it all organized. And so now they all show up to get things done. All right, in chapter 3, the work begins. All right, so they start gathering resources, gathering materials, putting everything back together. And then in chapter 4 is where all the big problems come. I mean, if it wasn't enough for them to, really a very small, it would kind of be like this. It would be like all of us in here, all right, maybe 60 people or so, if all of a sudden we decided, okay, we've got to go and the Pentagon has been destroyed, we're going to go build it. We're going to rebuild it. I mean, that's a pretty overwhelming task. That's a big building. If you've never seen the Pentagon, that's a big building. All right, or maybe the Missouri Capitol, that's another big building. I got to see it a few weekends ago when I was in Jeff City at Missouri Baptist headquarters. And so that, for a small group of us, that would be a big task. We don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the equipment. I mean, that would be an overwhelming task. So if that wasn't enough, now all of a sudden, the surrounding peoples, the Arab peoples that are around there, have decided that they are going to make fun of and even attack them while they're trying to do this. So let's take some time now and go to chapter 4 and read this together. Sorry, my phone has been attacked with many messages, which is great, but not timely. Okay, here we go. When Sanballat heard, okay, that's an enemy leader in the surrounding area, heard that we were rebuilding the wall, all right, so this is kind of a first-person Nehemiah here, he became furious. He mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria and said, What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it, meaning the city, by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble? So really what's happening here is there's kind of an information war, all right, a psychological war that's being imposed on the Jews. As they're trying to rebuild it, all these people are coming around, making fun of them, saying this is impossible, you're never going to be able to do this. That's kind of what happens there in those first few verses. Then, in verse 3, Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, "Indeed, even if a fox climbed up what they're building, he would break down their stone wall." Okay, so now in other words saying you guys are doing a terrible job. Verse 4, "Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have provoked the builders." Okay, so Nehemiah prays a pretty intense prayer here. All right, sometimes we get so caught up in what we're doing, we forget that God is the one that gives us the ability to accomplish the task that is before us. But Nehemiah, rather than getting all into that and hurling insults back and everything, the first thing that he does as a response is he prays. He seeks the Lord. He seeks God out. In verse 6, "So we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined together up to half of its height, for the people had the will to keep working. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the repair to the walls of Jerusalem was progressing and that the gaps were being closed, they became furious. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw it into confusion." All right, so now this is a very serious thing. You've got all these people, okay, and they're not out there by themselves. There's families, there's women, there's children, and they're all living there kind of in the ruins trying to get all this accomplished. And now all these leaders have come together, in which they're all kind of enemies, but it's kind of bound them together, saying, okay, we got to take out the Jews before they rebuild the great city of Jerusalem. And now they've kind of declared war. Well, not kind of, they have declared war on them. So what do they do? What does Nehemiah lead the Jews to do? "So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them day and night." Okay, so now notice this though. They pray and they seek the Lord, but then they move into action. All right, they don't just huddle up and have a little prayer meeting and then hope that it all turns out okay. They took action. All right, why did they do that? Well, because God uses us. I mean, that's how He accomplishes His purpose. Now, that's, of course, what the Scriptures, their intent is to help us understand how God accomplishes His purposes. And that's why, as we tackle this topic of discouragement, we have to understand that we have a responsibility. All right, let's continue. "In Judah it was said, 'The strength of the laborer fails. Since there is so much rubble, we will never be able to rebuild the wall.' And our enemies said, 'They won't know or see anything until we're among them and can kill them and stop the work.' When the Jews who lived nearby arrived, they said to us time and again, 'Everywhere you turn, they attack us.' So I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall. At the vulnerable areas, I stationed them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.'" Okay, so Nehemiah kind of establishes this militia of people, and they're going to protect the workers while they're working. All right, so this is problematic in a lot of ways. First of all, as was mentioned here, so we got families, so we've got to protect the families that are there. Then the work is the level of work has had to drop because now you've got people that are having to be on guard. And then the people that are still working, they're armed, which we'll see here in a little bit more, and so they're going to have to be ready. It kind of reminds me of the Minutemen, from a few centuries ago. And they've got to be ready to stop what they're doing immediately and get ready to fight a battle. All right, so imagine, we get out, maybe some of us have jobs outside. I have rental houses to take care of, so I'm outside a lot and in the heat working on stuff. So imagine you're doing that all day, and now, in the middle of that, you think about how frustrating it is. No project ever goes the way you want it to go, and it's hot, and you're hungry and tired and thirsty, and all these things. Now all of a sudden, okay, here comes this gang of people, and now you got to fight them off. I mean, a very frustrating and discouraging situation. So what happens next? And we're in verse 15 if you're following along. And if not, that's fine. You can just listen as the story unravels. When our enemies heard that we knew their scheme and that God had frustrated it, every one of us returned to his own work on the wall. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half held spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers supported all the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. The laborers who carried the loads worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped around his waist while he was building, and the trumpeter was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is enormous and spread out, and we are separated far from one another along the wall. All right, now so you got to imagine here that this is not like they're all building one building. Okay, they're building this huge city, and the walls are beyond the city, and they go far around, and there's hills, and I mean, it could take you several hours to get from one side of the work area to the other side. Okay, because there's no monorails or helicopters or transporters or whatever. All right, they had to walk or ride a camel or a donkey or something. So they were separated all along, so it was hard to coordinate everything. You know, if they were getting attacked from the north, then the people in the south, they had a terrible time communicating that. And so it was very difficult. All right, that's what he's talking about there. At that time, I also said to the people, let everyone and his servant spend the night inside Jerusalem, so that they can stand guard by night and work by day. And I, my brothers, my men, and the guards with me never took off our clothes. Each carried his weapon, even when washing. All right, so that's how difficult the security was. They couldn't really even stop because, they would kind of go in the river and wade and such, and you would remove your clothing when you would do that. And they couldn't even do that because the imminency, I don't know if that's a word, of the attack was always upon them. And so it was a problem. So you might say, okay, well, that's a great story, but where does that get us? Well, I think that this story is a perfect representation of our life, of how we can respond if we choose. Because somehow, like I think Nehemiah and the Jews, they thought that what they were going to do is get some materials and go build something. And that was their expectation. Their goal was success. They were focused on the success. That's what they wanted to do. And even though Nehemiah, he kept his eyes on the Lord and he searched out the Lord, I can imagine that many of the people there, it was very discouraging, it was very frustrating, because as they weren't counting on having to fight. They weren't counting on having to stay up all night being on guard after working all day. And things happen. And yet, we know this. I mean, even if you're not a student of history, you know that life is full of hardship. Life is full of suffering, of difficulty. And yet, somehow, we get up in the morning and we don't expect it to come. We think that things, you ever heard people say, well, things next week it's going to be better, or this next promotion is just right around the corner, or, we're always somehow thinking that the hardship is only for this time and then it's just going to go away. But the problem is that our ignorance makes us vulnerable. When instead we should accept and realize that life is difficult at times, that there will always be hardships, there will always be struggles, and as long up until Christ returns and he restores everything to the way that it was supposed to have been before he wrecked it all, that's how things are going to be. And so the sooner we decide to accept that, and we decide to change our goals, to change how we define success, to change what our expectations are, we're going to continue to be susceptible to that cycle over and over and over again until we die. And we're never going to experience the peace and the victory that we can have by having the right biblical and godly perspective in our lives. William Wiersbe says, anything that keeps you from doing what God has called you to do will only help the enemy. So there's a premise here, and Warren Wiersbe, if you don't know, he's a very famous Bible commentator, exegetical scholar, theologian type person. And what he's getting at is that we often fail to understand the real issue. We fail to miss the foundational principles of life. And then when we get in the middle of life, we're dazed and confused. We don't get it. We don't understand why bad things happen. We don't understand why things happen the way they do. And it's because we've missed an underlying truth. And so you might ask, hopefully, well, what is that underlying truth? The underlying truth is that we are in the midst of a great war. That there's a great battle, a spiritual battle that happens. I wish I could describe it to you in specific detail, because I don't fully understand it myself, but I see the effects of it. I see the effects of it lived out in our lives. And there's a battle for our culture, there's a battle for our hearts, there's a battle for our families. It is constant, it is unrelenting. The Bible itself says that there will always be wars and rumors of wars. And I don't think it's talking just about the actual wars that we fight with guns and ammo, but I think it's talking about the spiritual battle that Satan wages against God. And because we're so narrow in our understanding of what warfare is, we get picked off. You know, a soldier that's not been properly trained has no place being on the battlefield because he is a risk to himself and to the people around him. And yet we'd go trotting off into life, just kind of skippity-doo-dahing, thinking everything is okay and just ignorance is bliss or something like that. And then when we get caught off guard or we get flanked, to use military terminology, then we're waylaid. I mean, we're on the ground and we're down, and our productivity's gone, our witness is gone. If we're parents, our ability to teach our children is gone. I mean, whatever leadership role we have, whatever influence we have in people's lives, it is conquered, it is damaged because we respond in an inappropriate way. So what am I saying? That if you take some magic spiritual pill, you'll never be discouraged? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we have to realize that discouragement is coming. It most definitely will come. Remember the quote we started out with, that discouragement is dissatisfaction with the past, distaste for the present, and distrust of the future. All of those are personal issues that we are carrying into that situation. So you might ask at this point, or at least if I was sitting out there, I'd be thinking, well, so are you saying you never think positively, never see the half full glass? And those of you who know me know that I'm the half full glass person. I always see things as better than they are typically. And for those realists of you, I just find it your mission in life just to kind of, bring me down and help me see reality, which is probably a good thing because I kind of have my head up here in the clouds. So by no means that's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when we choose to understand the inevitable and we recognize that war is at work, and we recognize that if we're children of the King, that means that we're heirs, and that means that the enemy is going to come against us because of who our Father is. And so we have to be ready for that. We have to be prepared spiritually. We have to be disciplined. I mean, that's why it is amazing to me how much the Bible talks about being self-controlled. We see it in the Old Testament, we see it in the New Testament, discipline, self-control. Those are so important for us because it's when we lack those things we self-destruct. It's when we lose control of the choices we know we ought to make. It's kind of like getting on a raft on crazy wild water, and you're just going, and wherever that stream takes you, maybe over a waterfall, I mean, you've completely departed from any ability to maneuver out of harm's way. That we just kind of jump on the raft and we start going down the path of life, and we're not ready, we're not prepared. So what can we take away from this story here, from Nehemiah's story? Now, in the end, they're successful. They're victorious, and through overwhelming odds, overwhelming opposition, enemies all around them. I mean, think about their supply lines. When you're surrounded by enemies, you're not getting the resources you need. But in spite of all of that, they were able to, for the most part, rebuild the city. How did that happen? Well, instead of them quitting when it got terrible, they recognized, called upon the Lord, and they drew strength from that. Did that fix all our problems? Not at all. It took years and years and years, and they were 2 steps forward, 1 step back through this whole process. But they drew strength from the understanding that it's that process that's the goal. Remember what Mother Teresa said? That her ministry is a ministry of mercy, not success. So when they stopped trying to complete this worldly project and they realized that the obedience to what God had called them to do was the goal, was the mission, then they had the only way that they could fail, the only way they could truly become discouraged is if they quit. See, it changed the rules of the game. Instead of the game being all about rebuilding the city, which was absolutely an important outcome, the goal was that God had called them to this task. And so they were faithful to the task, whether they succeeded in the task or not. Whether they developed all the things out of that they wanted to or not, their goal was to be obedient to what God had asked them to do. So for many of us, what needs to happen in our life is that we need to change the way that we define success. And we need to change the way that we're living our life. Instead of living our lives to accomplish great things in God's name, we just need to be obedient and faithful to the small things that He's called us to do. Because in that process, He will shape us, He will mold us, and He will build into us the things that we have to have in order to accomplish things that are bigger than us. Because the truth is, there's really no limit imposed upon us of what we can accomplish in our lives. The most significant limiting factor is us. And so what will you choose to do today? Will you choose to be adjusted, to be shaped by the task at hand? Or will you choose to just dart out in ignorance and just hope that things work out? You know, I can remember when I was a young man, and I think probably for men and women, I think, that 17 to 20, 21 era of life is maybe one of the most challenging times of life, because you're transitioning from one world where your parents kind of take care of things, and even if you totally mess up, they can kind of fix it, and for the most part, and so you're in that world, and then you transition to this other world where you're responsible, and when things don't go well, when you mess up, you're the one that's got to fix it. And that's a hard transition, because it's just easier to rely on somebody else than to stand up and do things for ourselves. And I think we've maybe developed this culture of people that have made comfort so high of a priority, and they've made ease of life and money and riches and control such a high priority that we have forgotten what life is really about. And so, which one of those people are you this afternoon? Have you kind of got lost? Have you kind of fell into that pit of discouragement? And man, I feel bad for you. I know what it's like to be in that place. But the truth is that if you're being obedient to what God's called you to do, then it doesn't matter what obstacles you have. It doesn't matter what problems you have. It doesn't matter if you're broke, if you're hurt, if you're, whatever it is, that God is going to see you through that. And sometimes that can even mean going home and to be with Him. That can mean leaving this earth and going home to be with Him. Sometimes that's what that means. But the win isn't that great accomplishment that we think in our minds. It's not the American dream. It's not having a certain level of education. It's not accomplishing a certain task. But it's just being faithful. If you could find 5 people that would be faithful to the Lord, then 500,000 people can accomplish the same great things that those 5 can accomplish. And so where we always find ourselves, it seems at this point in the day, is that the burden is on us. At some point we have to choose to give our burden over to the Lord. He's not just going to come take it from us. We have to choose to give it to Him. There are people in this room right now that care about you so much that they would give up a lot of what they have to help you. And so to feel isolated, to feel alone, to feel discouraged is only a false reality that the enemy is trying to impose on you to discourage you and to blind you from the truth. So let's take some time and pray, and then I'll close this. Lord, thank you for the truth that you shared with us. It's been kind of a different day as we've really focused in on this story in Nehemiah. And we've been challenged with the juxtaposition of how we live our lives and how we ought to live our life. God, first I just pray for that man or that woman, that child that's just in the pit of despair right now, Lord. That the obstacles are so overwhelming in their life that they just don't even know where to start. I pray, Lord, that you would comfort them. I pray that you would bring provision and encouragement to them even now as your Spirit is at work. We know you've promised us that if we will seek you out, that we will find you, and that you will give us truth, that you will help us to accomplish your tasks. And God, I pray right now that you would work in our minds, that we would come to understand that you've not called us to a life of defeat and of sadness and unhappiness, but you call us to a life of victory, a life of overcoming overwhelming obstacles, a life of falling down and getting back up again. So Lord, would you change us? Would you help us to be the people that we know we ought to be? To find within your Spirit the strength to take those next steps, whatever they are in our life. Lord, would you just move and work in our hearts today? And we just thank you and ask it in Jesus' name.